Welcome to the podcast, Stories from the World of Science. Our mission is to explain science in a simple and fun form that is open to all.
Watching the birth of a new language. In 1769, the Berlin Academy of Sciences offered a prize for the best response to the following question about the origin of language. Supposing that human beings were left to their own natural faculties, would they be in a condition to invent a language? And, if so, by what means would they manage to invent it? We are looking for a hypothesis that would explain the problem in a clear manner and give an answer to all its different aspects. The winner of the prize was Gottfried Herder with his essay on the origin of language. Herder reveals his approach in the very first sentence of his essay. Already as an animal, the human being has language. It is unlikely, however, that any of Herder's fellow contestants would have expected that, one day, people would observe with their own eyes the spontaneous birth of a new language, an event which took place just a few decades ago. For several centuries, the question about the origin of language was one of the central subjects for debate between philosophers and other scholars. The interest in the mystery of the nature of language reached its peak in the Age of Enlightenment, when the great questions about nature and the origin of man came to the forefront of scientific thought. Is language innate or acquired? Why are there so many different languages in the world, if language is a gift of nature? What kind of language would children develop if they were left alone on a desert island after being born? The question about the origin of language can first be encountered in the story about the unusual experiment carried out by the Egyptian king Psammetichus, the account of which may be found in Herodotus' history. Psammetichus wanted to find out whether Egyptians truly were the oldest people on the face of the earth, but was, despite his efforts, unable to find a way which would put him on the trail of the original man. In order to solve the mystery, he conducted a true scientific experiment. He took 2 newborn babies from randomly chosen parents and entrusted them into the care of a shepherd who had been instructed to keep them in his flock. The shepherd was ordered not to speak a single word in their presence and to leave them lying alone in an isolated space, gradually accustoming them to 2 goats. After the children had had their share of milk, the shepherd would go on with his chores. King Psammetichus isolated the 2 children from all cultural influences because he wanted to hear what word the children would utter first after progressing from inarticulate babbling. This is what actually happened. 2 years after the beginning of the experiment, when, one day, the shepherd opened the door and entered the room, the boys threw themselves at him, hands reached out, calling out "Bikos." When Psammetichus heard them with his own ears, he wished to know which language the word "Bikos" belonged to and what it meant. He found out that it was the Phrygian word for bread. From this experience, the Egyptians concluded and admitted that Phrygians were older than them. Even though many scholars over subsequent centuries probably considered carrying out an experiment similar to King Psammetichus, this could naturally not be allowed. That is why scientists were even more excited a few decades ago when an event comparable to King Psammetichus' experiment took place quite spontaneously. In addition, the children that happened to be involved in this unusual experiment even gained from it, and none of them suffered like the boys in Herodotus. This time the story took place not in Egypt, but in Nicaragua. At the end of the 1970s, the life of deaf children in Nicaragua changed immensely. When the Sandinistas came to power, one of the changes they introduced was the reform of public education throughout the country. In Managua, they opened a new school center for educating children with special needs. Before, parents usually kept deaf children at home because at the time deafness was stigmatized. Within families, communication with deaf children usually consisted of a few simple gestures which were no more than the bare essentials required on a daily basis. In the capital of Nicaragua, a smaller school trying to teach the deaf to speak Spanish had been open for several decades, but with no great success. It was only when the larger school was established that for the first time deaf children from different parts of the country were brought together in substantial numbers. Gathering this large group of children who had no effective means of communication proved to be the key element leading to the creation of a new language. The teachers tried teaching the children using a Russian method based on a visual alphabet system recommended by Soviet instructors, but this was quite unsuccessful. However, the children started spending time together outside the confines of the school and exchanged visits like other ordinary children. To their surprise, the teachers gradually started to realize that the children were very good at communicating with each other. Yet while they could communicate with one another very well using gestures, the teachers had a difficult time understanding them. In June 1986, the Nicaraguan Ministry of Education contacted an American scientist, Judy Cagle, an expert on the linguistics of sign language. She was invited to visit the school for the deaf in Managua and to try and find out how these children were communicating. Needless to say, the 33-year-old professor immediately embarked for Nicaragua. Cagle quickly discovered that the children were not using any of the many established sign languages, but had developed an entirely new way to communicate using gestures. After a few days of observation, she managed to learn the sign for house or home and to ask the children where they lived. Each of the children responded with a series of complex, at first sight completely meaningless hand gestures. It was not until later that she discovered that the series of gestures actually described in great detail how to take the bus to each of the children's homes. At the beginning, she faced many difficulties because she could not make out the grammar of the language used by the deaf children. Later she remembered how at first everything seemed very chaotic. After 3 weeks, she also visited the school for younger children. On her first day, she watched a girl in the school courtyard accompanying her signing with quick and rhythmical hand gestures. Cagle realized the child was not simply mimicking the signs she had observed in older children. This is how she recalled. I looked at her, and I thought to myself, holy cow, that girl is using some kind of rule book. And Singh has, at the time Cagle's assistant, also remembers this event with great excitement. It was a linguist's dream. It was like being present at the Big Bang. Using a special universal system for writing down gestures, also known as sign writing, which is used by about 3,000 people, several books and textbooks have already been translated into the language of the Nicaraguan deaf children. In addition, much research has been carried out and many scientific discussions have been written, tackling essentially the same key question the Berlin Academy of Sciences had set for its prize in 1769. To this day, scientists have yet to reach an agreement as to what extent language is innate or acquired. Either way, the discovery of the spontaneous birth of a new deaf language in Nicaragua has opened the way to many new findings of great help in our search for the answer to the great question about the nature of language, a question that humankind has been contemplating ever since the times of the Egyptian king Psammetichus, if not even longer.
You just listened to the podcast, Stories from the World of Science, written by Sasho Dolines.